of each of these.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kawale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
I am hugely terrific. You pulled out another incredibly gorgeous shirt.
Man, I have to start paying you for complimenting me every time, my friend.
Where do you get these shirts from? These incredibly gorgeous shirts.
So I told you a long time ago that I look up to you.
And you actually now look like you are much better than the kid that you used to look up to.
A warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. And today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues. But I think for people out there who are fans of Britain, let's start in Britain. So we have, it looks like we have a new Prime Minister designate. He's not yet Prime Minister until maybe tomorrow after Theresa May officially hands over number 10 Downing Street. Your thoughts, Shaka?
First of all, why do you seem to be doubtful? I mean, why do you say it looks like?
Well, he's not officially sworn in.
Yeah, but the man is the Prime Minister designate, so what else are you talking about? I mean, all in fact that has to happen is a process. A constitutional process, as it were, even though, by the way, in case you may have forgotten your political science or your international relations, the British are an incredible people, for it is the only country that has a constitution that is not written. They have an unwritten constitution, and they basically pretty much go about business based on conventions and tradition and all that kind of stuff.
What makes Boris Johnson tick, Shaka? I know for sure he led the Brexit campaign in 2016. He was one of those champions campaigning for Brexit. What does he bring to the table?
He was obviously one of those people that were in the front line of the Brexit. But I think a lot of credit probably recently seems to be given to Nigel Farage, the man that in fact as we talk has a political party that is in fact called Brexit. And he shocked the traditional parties, both the Labour and the Tories, during the European Parliament elections. So he seems to be the face more recently of Brexit. But, you know, Boris is quite an interesting guy. Of course, as you know, he ran into a bit of controversy with some British who felt that he probably was actually qualified to be a foreigner, simply because he was born in New York, which happens to be a state of the United States of America. And his father was obviously working here and all that kind of stuff. But this is a man that has very impeccable credentials. He went to some of the best schools that money can buy in the United Kingdom, ending up, of course, at Oxford. And he used to be one of those people that hung around the Oxford Debating Union and all that kind of stuff. Interestingly, you hear some of his views, which are anti-immigration and what have you. You can't believe that, in fact, he traces his origin. His ancestors, in fact, come from modern-day Turkey. He is also somebody that seems to be politically on the same page with the man who happens to be in charge of the United States of America, the man who is the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Donald Trump.
You make a very, very good point there. A lot of people, a lot of analysts have been comparing the two, saying that, in fact, Boris Johnson, who is going to be occupying number 10 Downing Street, is very close to Trump in terms of policies, in terms of their stand against immigration, in terms of their stand against the faces the changing faces of Britain and the changing faces of the United States and so many other things. When they make a comparison, some analysts have said that he's a mirror image of U.S. President Donald Trump.
Well, we really have to wait and see, because let's face it, when politicians are running for office, they tend to campaign in poetry. But when it comes to the business of governing, that one, they tend to, in fact, do in prose. So, Boris Yeltsin, I mean, not Boris Yeltsin, obviously, that is the former president of Russia. When you talk about this Boris, he runs the United Kingdom. And since he runs the United Kingdom, there is already a feeling, for example, that the United Kingdom is not its own man, that it is not its own, kind of like entity, that for some strange reason it plays a subordinate role to the United States of America. Mm-hmm. And so he may probably have to figure out a way, sincerely, of looking rather independent, an independent prime minister of the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. And so he could end up probably making some tweaks around policy positions and all that kind of stuff. But when you think about it, really, the United Kingdom has actually played a subordinate role to the United States since the Second World War. I mean, you look at the Marshall Plan and all that kind of stuff and a lot of things and what have you. But I think it's really a question of wait and see before we probably become the judge and the jury.
Before we continue, let me apologize to our Facebook followers watching us live. We seem to be having a technical problem. Our network is really, really bad, but hopefully we'll come back on air and you'll catch up with the show. Going back to Boris Johnson, there are a lot of critics who say that he's too far to the right. And when you look at what's happening globally, you cannot really run a country like Great Britain or the United States if you are too extreme to either the right or to the left.
Well, luckily, when you talk about the United States and you talk about the United Kingdom, both are democratic nations. Both have some kind of inbuilt system of checks and balances. And so both really have what you call, or come from a tradition that boasts strong institutions. So for you, for example, to be the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House, you really have to navigate your way by negotiating around the institutions. You are not as very independent, for example, as, for example, a president from the developing country, or a prime minister from a developing country, where you can actually call shots in the manner in which, for example, at some point, the King of France, King Louis, used to talk about how he was, in a sense, the state. And the state was him. He said, l'état c'est moi. There are a lot of l'état c'est moi, for example, in Africa. There's no question about it. In fact, the President of the United States is probably one of the weakest chief executives. Because, again, like I said, he really has to negotiate his way around the strong institutions. He also has to kind of like wheel and deal, give and take, when it comes to dealing, for example, with Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Not forget that there is also the judiciary. When you talk about the Chief Justice of the United States, he is very independent. There are 3 branches of government that are equal. when you talk about Britain also, it's a democratic society. It has parliament. Parliament has a lot of power. So Boris has to figure out a way how to negotiate his way. It is not as simple as it may look.
Let me do a quick follow-up. You talked about how, for example, the system here, the president has to navigate his way around, but you also talked about the Supreme Court here, how it's one of the most powerful institutions. And I'm also reminded of the fact that the only thing where really the president, one of the reasons why the president is working hard to maintain the Supreme Court is he knows that, for example, those judges can decide to take sides. They're not as independent as I would like to think, or our viewers would like to think. The U.S. Supreme Court is not as independent. That's why, for example, Republicans fight to put conservative judges.
It is true in as far as the judges are human beings. But the history, the political history of the United States, if you read it very carefully, you will find that you may not pretty much support your position. As a matter of fact, even the current Chief Justice himself, who was appointed by George W. Bush, when it came to the issue of Obamacare and what have you, I am sure you have not forgotten what he actually did. So, yes, there are times when their votes basically reflect party positions and all that kind of stuff, but there are a lot of other situations when they, in fact, put the country, the nation, above all else, and they basically look at the law and the facts.
Very briefly, before we move on to another topic, do you think Boris Johnson is going to deliver the Brexit, considering the fact that since Tony Blair, we've had like 4 prime ministers? You're looking at Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, now Boris Johnson. Can he deliver?
Yeah, but I don't know why you have to go back and talk about Tony Blair and what have you, because those ones
I'm looking at the turnover, in terms of turnover.
And the basically Labour Party lost out, and then you have David Cameron. Maybe you should start from David Cameron, because they belong, in fact, in the same party. You're talking about Theresa May. Theresa May was never, in fact, supposed to be prime minister. This job was supposed actually to be taken by this guy, who has actually later on gotten the job that he was supposed to hold. So I think it is also largely going to depend on how he deals with the parliament, obviously, which is controlled by his party. He's right now, by the way, the leader of the Tories. He's the leader of the Conservative Party, and hence that's how he ends up becoming the Prime Minister, first among equals.
You are watching Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you live every Tuesday, and today we are talking about the change of guard in Great Britain. Right now we are switching here to the United States. We are looking at the island of Puerto Rico. There is so much happening there. The governor is being called out. People want him to step down, allegedly because of some corruption scandals, and some of the statements attributed to him via social media.
Cronyism and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Your thoughts on that?
I think what we are seeing in Puerto Rico very, very clearly is not something that is limited to Puerto Rico. We are looking at when politicians tell us that power belongs to the people. This is a very good example, if not an excellent example, which clearly demonstrates that, yes, indeed, power belongs to the people. You're talking about more than a quarter of the population of the island went actually out and voted with its feet and saying, you know what, we are tired of you and all that kind of stuff. You need to step aside so that we can move on. And this is not by the way, this is not only something that has happened in Puerto Rico. It is interesting that it has also historically, to a certain degree, happened on the great mother continent of Africa. You remember, for example, Burkina Faso. The handsome Blaise Compaoré. You remember what he wanted to do? He wanted to shift again the constitutional political goalposts and all kind of stuff. And the people simply voted with their feet, even to the extent that they nearly burnt parliament and what have you. And eventually, guess what? Handsome Blaise Compaoré had to head for the nearest political tall grass.
Now he's in exile.
Now he's in exile.
Should people standing up on their feet maybe to get rid of these long-time leaders be the new trend since they have failed to take them out with a ballot paper?
Well, first of all, it is their political right, especially if in fact they are protesting the socio-economic political injustice that bedevils their society, so long as they are not violent. So long as they are not violent, they are very peaceful, they are very respectable and dignified. But in fact, stand on their feet and say, enough is enough. Because let's face it, presidents usually tell us, especially in Africa, that power belongs to the people. But in fact, does power, when you think about it, across the continent, does power really belong to the people? Power belongs to those individuals who reside in a state house.
That's a good point. Let's go to a comment from Stephen Kadambuzi Malava. Mr. Shaka, I ask you a question. When are you going to talk about Zimbabwe? You just said power belongs to the people. Does power really belong to the people in Zimbabwe?
Well, not, of course, from the way things look like in Harare, but they can, first of all, society is not static. It is dynamic. So are people. People are equally dynamic. They are not static. There is a point where people can reach and they will say, enough is enough. It happened in Burkina Faso.
Sudan.
It just happened in the Sudan. At one time, it happened in the great, beautiful island of Madagascar. Those things can happen. It actually also, I remember, happened in the Ivory Coast when Babo became president, when General Robert Gay headed for the nearest political tall grass. This was a general. He was trying to figure out a way of using what a lot of dictators use on the continent when it comes to selections as opposed to elections, trying to use creative accounting and trying to say he is the president. The people went on the street. It is true that some of them were killed and what have you, but at the end of the day, General Robert Gay was the man that headed for the nearest political tall grass, and there was not enough grass, not a sufficient grass that could cover him. He went and life goes on.
Let's go to another topic. Let's talk about corruption. Today, the consortium of investigative reporters just unleashed a whole barrage of corruption allegations. Some leaders in Africa stealing a lot from their people. And speaking of in Kenya, the government is cracking down on corruption. As of yesterday, the finance minister, Mr. Henry Rotich, was arrested on corruption allegations. How big is corruption in some of these countries?
It is almost normal. It's almost the norm, actually. It's almost the norm, just corruption. Can you believe, for example, it is Africa probably, one of the few places in Africa where the people who are very rich, the people who have deep pockets, are not the people who own factories, are not the people who create jobs, are not the people who have companies like the Bill Gates of the world and what have you, or Bezos, of Amazon and you name it. They are political leaders. They are basically political actors who are at the same time rich. Where do you think they get the money from? They get the money from the government coffers. They basically get the money from the poor taxpayers. They are basically sitting on the backs of the poor taxpayers. You have a situation where, for example, most of Africa, where these countries are democratically challenged, these rulers, I hesitate to call them leaders, they have basically ruined, for example, the medical care infrastructure to the extent that ordinary people, when they get sick, they have nowhere to go. It is sometimes it is really very, very disappointing and some degree very unconscionable, to the extent that sometimes when you look at a great country like Nigeria, when some of the Nigerian rich people, the ogas, when they actually go for medical treatment, for example, in South Africa or in the United Kingdom, guess who are the doctors and the nurses who actually come to treat them? They are fellow Nigerians. You can say the same thing about Uganda.
Yeah. And in fairness to Nigerians, any time you go to a hospital here or any law firm, anything of that nature, you find Nigerian doctors.
But the
highly skilled Nigerian doctors.
Yes, indeed. But the Nigerians who are in control of governments, of states, of the federal government and what have you, a lot of them, guess where they go for medical checkup?
Yeah.
It's like really what you would call some kind of tourism, really, of sorts, you know. And I think part of it is because you do not have a situation sincerely on the ground where there is this concept of accountability, where the people who have been elected to the office or people who have imposed themselves through selections do not account to anybody, because in fact they don't feel that they owe anybody. And the reason is very simple, because the election or the electoral process is not fair. And yet you are talking about a country, a society, where everybody should actually have the same equal shares. It's not really an opportunity for just very few people to act and almost behave like what you read or what you watch in the movies about the American mafias, for example.
Quick follow-up, talking about people holding these leaders accountable. There's a comment here. In your opinion, do you think Sudan's power-sharing agreement will work?
You know, first of all, I really don't know whether it will work or it will not, but I simply hope and wish that it works. Because when you think about it, what is the other option? It has to work. From where Sudan is coming from, and from where most of the Africa is coming from, this deal has to work. Because frankly, under the circumstances, it's probably the best deal that the Sudanese people could get. And I would hope that both the domestic and the regional and international environment will make sure, will hold and bring about pressure, sufficient pressure to bear on the authorities in the Sudan to abide by the signatures that they appended on that important document, so that Sudanese people, at least for the first time, can live in peace and stability. Because at the end of the day, frankly, that is what everybody should be playing for. We should be able to bring about democracy, because democracy, frankly, is an equal opportunity employer. We're talking about social, economic, political justice for everybody, not for just a few people.
Speaking of democracy, let's go to Noah. Do you think democracy is good for Africa, or we should just resort to our own kind of democracy? a foreign democracy, a Western democracy?
First of all, democracy is democracy. Democracy is a universal value. There is no such a thing as Western democracy, African democracy, Latin American democracy. No, it is democracy. It is about fairness. It's about accountability. It's about social, economic, political justice. When we talk about justice, it has to be seen. Society has to be seen to be just. We have to have societies which are governed by laws. Societies of laws, not societies of men or women. We have to have a situation where we have a society, an environment where not particular individual, including the person who occupies the office of the president, is not above the law. Nobody should be above the law. Everybody should be equal in the eyes of the law.
Speaking of equal in the eyes of the law, there is a quick follow-up here from Peter. Mr. Shaka, do you think, given the opportunity, Museveni can hand over power to an opposition leader if defeated?
First of all, I really don't see even why such a question should be asked, because it almost presupposes that Museveni, in fact, owns Uganda, as if, in fact, Uganda was his personal property. On the contrary, Uganda, the last time I checked, is a republic. It is not a monarchy, nor is it a kingdom, nor is it a personal real estate belonging to President Yoweri Museveni. And I think that if you actually have an election conducted according to the Constitution, conducted very well, and what have you, and someone is in fact declared the winner, I don't see any particular reason, sincerely, why President Yoweri Museveni would have problems handing over power or the reins of power to that particular individual. But again, that question, frankly, is what I would have called, when I was in universities, a hypothetical type of question, and therefore requires probably an equally hypothetical type of answer.
Interesting. What are you talking about tomorrow, Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow, my friend, you've been working on it. You know, we are talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area. That is a great, great event that is going to happen, and it was, by the way, introduced by Rwandan President, Major General Paul Kagame. But there are people who say, in fact, what should happen first and foremost in order for such a very important program to succeed is for Africa, first and foremost, to introduce the equivalent of the American Constitutional First Amendment, which is freedom of expression. What is needed in Africa really is African continental freedom of expression, so that people, everybody, has a right to own an opinion and to weigh in those policies, for example, that govern him or her. But otherwise, we are definitely going to look at this great idea and see whether, in fact, it can work. Because if it works, it will provide a lot of answers, bring a lot of solutions.
On that note, thank you so much for this edition. I will look forward to hosting you on another show of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, thank you so much from Washington.
You're most welcome.
Good night and goodbye.